these years. I'm approaching a birthday this week. I'll turn 39, so it'll be the last year of my 30s. How I feel about that. But because of that, you get to be, I'm one of those reflective, philosophical type people, and so I began to think about things. And as I was working on this sermon, something kind of struck me as kind of humorous and kind of going along with it. You feel like this pressure to, you're trying to mold your children to be something that you want them to be. For us, you want them to be productive adults. That's kind of the whole goal, is to get them out of the nest and go kind of be that kind of productive adult with their life. And so, and mine are closing in. I've got a teenager and one on the verge of being a teenager. So you're getting kind of like to that point where it's kind of like the clutch time. You're like, okay, only got just a few more years before they get to that point. So we have this thing in our heads, kind of like you want kids to do when they become adults. And one of those things I think for me and my wife too is, you want to instill this good sense of personal hygiene, especially when they're getting to this teenage phase. They smell. They just do. Remember having a baby? And a baby, unless the baby was sick or, had a really bad diaper, you didn't have to bathe them but every 3 days, and they always smelled so great. And then at some point, about mid-childhood, that changes. And they just start to smell. And so you've got to kind of work on this with your children, like the basics. And I feel like ever since they were able to verbalize this communication, I feel like I've been asking the same questions over and over to my children. Did you wash your hands? Did you bathe? Did you brush your teeth? Now keep in mind, we're a fairly routine-driven household. I firmly follow the path, set forth in Ecclesiastes. And if you ever read Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament, it's kind of one of those really philosophical passages. I think it's in Ecclesiastes 2 or 3 where it talks about, there's a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to search and a time to give up. I don't feel like this author was ever the parent of like small children or a teenager, because for me it's like there's a time to brush your teeth, there's a time to take a bath. There's never not a time to not take a bath. There's just, you need to take a bath. There's a time to go to sleep. So that's mine. If he was a parent, that would be kind of how his whole routine would be driven, this cyclical routine. So keep in mind, we've been following this routine with these children for roughly 12 years. Now, after all of this time, we will still get into the car on Tuesdays and Thursdays when we all ride to school together. And we'll all get in the car, shut the car doors, and I will inevitably ask, kids, did you brush your teeth? And I can just see them now. What they do is they look across the front of their teeth. Then they look up to the sky as if God is going to somehow give some sort of divine intervention into this question. And inevitably they'll be like, no. And I would like to say that I am an understanding, patient parent, and I just say, okay, now, no. I'm like, really? We've been doing this how many years and you haven't brushed your teeth? Go inside and brush your teeth. That's usually how it ends up. And then Ben will say, Dad, don't yell at me. He's my emotional kid. And so then that's one of the ones. Also, coming out of a bathroom, in a restaurant, did you wash your hands? Now, sometimes they don't. They'll turn right back around in and go in there and wash their hands. But now, Ben, he's very proud of it when he washes his hands, and so and he's very scared of the air dryers for some reason. This is a new phobia we've developed. Like, he won't use them at all. So he'll walk out with wet hands, and then he'll rub them on you and say, see, I washed my hands. So that's always fun, too. Irrational fear, I don't know where it came from. Or sometimes, now my favorite approach of dodging personal hygiene among my children, they don't do this as much as they used to, but when we're about from about 5 to 10, the fun thing was, you'd send them in to take a bath. And then they would come out and you would ask, did you take a shower? And then, you always kind of smell the top of their head because that's just what you do. And they still stink. And you go, did you use soap? To which their reply is, you didn't tell me to use soap. Now, at this point in my mind, I've often thought, they would make really good Pharisees. They know exactly how to keep the letter of the law, but they missed the spirit that in which it was given. Today, children. And you're wondering, how in the world does that relate to today's Bible story? I'm glad you asked. We're in Mark chapter 7. The Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus and saw some of his disciples eating food with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. The Pharisees and the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups and pitchers and kettles. So the Pharisees and the teachers of the law asked Jesus, "Why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders instead of eating their food with defiled hands?" He replied, "Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites, as it is written, 'These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teaching are merely human rules. You have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to human traditions.'" Now, it seems like, and I'm following the liturgy over the last few weeks, it's really becoming a broken record. Jesus is just minding his own business, doing his own thing, trying to teach the deep truths about the kingdom of God, and bam! These killjoy religious leaders show up. And they always seem to be right there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to pounce on the slightest infraction against what they say, trying every way possible to undermine Jesus' ministry. Here I just picture Jesus and his disciples are eating a meal, maybe enjoying a little break. And like a tattling sibling, here come the goody two-shoes, golden children of God up to Jesus, and they say, "Hey, your disciples didn't wash their hands." If you have siblings, you know how this works. Let's face it, nobody likes a snitch. Nobody. So first, a little background here to avoid some confusion. Now, for us sitting here in 2018, we might be quick to agree with the Pharisees. I mean, after all, eating in the ancient world wasn't the most hygienic practice. Food was kind of placed at the center of the table, and everybody just kind of grabbed or passed what they wanted. So for you germaphobes, you wouldn't have made it. Utensils were rare, just kind of beginning to be developed. And everybody usually ended up touching everybody else's food on the table. You're automatically going, ew. So maybe this whole hand washing thing wasn't necessarily a bad idea. But what I want you to keep in mind is that this is an ancient pre-modern science culture. So this is about 1,800 years before germ theory became the standard understanding of how diseases are transmitted. So for the Pharisees, it wasn't an issue of hygiene, but it was about holiness. And for the record, the pursuit of holiness, i.e. a relationship with God, isn't necessarily a bad thing in and of itself. But it was the way they went about it that was troubling. See, for them, holiness was bound up in a very literal, concrete interpretation of the laws found in the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And it separates the world into 2 categories: clean, unclean, holy, and defiled. Now, if you have ever read the Old Testament, specifically those first 5 books, you've discovered that this wasn't just some arbitrary thing that they chose to practice. Rather, it was a way of doing things commanded by God, and it was imperative that you get it right. The only problem is they ceased to see it as necessarily a way to God, and it was a way to kind of maintain social order. And they took these rules that were in there, and they made a whole bunch of other rules to go along with them. So for them, uncleanliness, this uncleanness, could be, I don't know if it's really uncleanliness or uncleanness. I don't know how that really works in that kind of perspective. But anyway, you get the point. It could be transferred to you unintentionally through everyday dealings with the world. So if you were out in the market and you needed to go out into the market to do, buy your daily food or just interact with people, and you may have to shake hands with a man who has a family member with leprosy or who touched a dead person, or a woman who was menstruating may have sat where you are sitting. And so you have to always be thinking of all of the, I know it's exhausting, right, of how ways you could be unclean. And if you really want to, if you're an anxious person, never read the Old Testament, that part of the Old Testament, because it would never, you'd be like, how in the world does anybody ever get anywhere. But that's how they develop these workarounds. So like if you were out in the marketplace and you unintentionally became unclean, then what you had to do is you had to go in and you had to do the ceremonial washing. Now the nearest modern expression I could think of to kind of portray how this works is everyone's favorite recess game of cooties. Remember how cooties worked? For whatever reason, the herd mentality of children, you always choose a kid that has the cooties. And the whole point of recess was to avoid being touched by that person, or avoid someone who touched that person lest you get infected with the cooties. Did you ever play that at recess? I don't know if you ever had that happen to you anyway. Say we're going to get to that here in a second. So, washing your hands, she's got it. So washing your hands was meant to prevent all that unclean defiled stuff from entering your body, and thus making you unclean on the inside. So all this ritual cleaning functioned kind of like what Amy talked about, the cootie shot. That's all it was. It was ritual, and then you're not unclean. So if a Jewish person actually watched this sermon, I'm sure I'm going to get into big trouble right now, kind of boiling it down to this. But don't worry, a little later I plan on offending the church as well. I feel like, you need to be an equal opportunity offender during sermons. So that's how this is going to go down. But Jesus wasn't really having any of their criticism. See, holiness isn't found in keeping a set of rules about ritual hand washing. They are found in understanding the spirit behind the commands of God. Rather than expanding on this and kind of talking about it, he cites a specific example of how the Pharisees were keeping the letter of the law, but were neglecting its spirit. We're going to pick it up here at verse 9. And he continued, "You have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions. For Moses said, 'Honor your father and mother,' and anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death. But you say that if anyone declares what might have been used to help their father or mother is korban, that is devoted to God, then you no longer let them do anything for their father or mother. Thus you nullify the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down. And you do many things like that." So this is kind of one of those little obscure passages I want to kind of unpack a little bit. You'll see just how clever Jesus is in calling out their hypocrisy. So in the ancient world, and in most Eastern cultures even today, the family is a very tightly connected unit. And it extends generationally. It extends down to the youngest generation and up to the oldest generation. Everybody has a responsibility of taking care of each other. And you see this a lot of times, especially still in Eastern cultures a little bit, where they have multi-generational households. Where to take care of grandma and grandpa, they move into your house and you take care of them. That was just kind of the way that it was expected to do. And you were expected to help them out. Social Security and things like that didn't exist. And so when they couldn't work, it was expected that the children would take care of them. Now this is also a financial burden as well. But it was commanded by God that you take care of the community. And if you failed in your duty, then your parents could possibly be impoverished. And that would make you a pariah to the rest of the community. I mean, nobody wants to be seen as the jerk who failed to take care of their parents. So what they could do as a workaround is you could take that portion of the income or kind of the service you were going to do, and you could set it aside from their parents, and you could call it korban, which means that you're going to dedicate this to God. Now, the rules were a little squidgy about what you had to do after that declaration. So you could just kind of declare that whatever this help is korban, it's dedicated to God. You could hold it for whatever holy purpose. And then once your parents were gone, you could undedicate it, and voila, now you have your money again. It was kind of like the first incidents of offshore banking. That's what you got. It was a way that they could keep the letter of the law, but not really do what they were supposed to do. And so Jesus is essentially calling them out on their unwillingness to take care of the people in their community. So the commands of God always circle back to love. Always. And then he goes home to he drives his real point home, starting in verse 14. Again, Jesus called the crowd to him and said, "Listen to me, everyone, and understand this. Nothing outside of a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it is what comes out of a person that defiles them. After he left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about this parable. Are you so dull, he asked? Don't you see that nothing that enters a person from the outside can defile them? For it doesn't go into their heart, but into their stomach, and then it goes out of the body. It's a very graphic description, I think. In saying this, Jesus declared all food clean. And he went on, what comes out of a person is what defiles them. For it is from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come. Sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All of these evils come from inside, and they are what defile a person. Evil doesn't come from touching someone who touched someone else who was unclean. And holiness isn't found in a religious ritual trying to undo that kind of cootie thought. One doesn't do evil because of anything on the outside. One isn't made unclean by another person's thoughtless actions. Rather, the source of all that is wrong with it, with everything, is found within each and every one of us. Thus, the role of faith, when it's working like it should, isn't to control people's actions, but to change our very nature. It is the interior work of learning how to see the world and people the way God does. And that, my friends, is where real holiness, what it really is, and let's face it, that's very hard work. I mean, it's much easier to control people through shame, through fear, through intimidation. And make no mistake, there have been times in church history where we have sold out our souls for that kind of temporal power. It's just so seductive. But doing that, seeking to control people through external means, doesn't do anyone any good. And it creates a very flat and dull religion. See, the goal of faith for me is to address that burning of the soul that I am firmly convinced resides in every person. That burning is this knowledge that in spite of my best effort, I am in no way qualified to be God. The burning within me that looks like this list that Jesus has. And we always think about Paul and his list, but Jesus, he had some too. And I can read through this list, and I can say that even after 38 years, I still need help controlling these things. See, the church today has become so obsessed with all the alleged evil out in the world that we have stopped talking about the evil within. We've become so obsessed with controlling people that we have forgotten that our mission is not control, but transformative change through a sacrificial love. See, I told you I'd get around to offending the church. See, the whole reason Jesus descended here to walk among us is that we ourselves we are incapable of ascending to God by ourselves. And every time we try to get to God, we just end up making ourselves God. And that's why Jesus came. As finite beings, we have no way on our own to even get close to God. See, Jesus came that we might have a real understanding of who God is and what God is about. Our God isn't a God who is obsessed with mind-numbing religious rituals designed to appease his anger. Ours is a God of love who makes himself less to demonstrate what real love is like. That love is what really changes us, not following religious rituals. Dear Heavenly Father, I love you so much, and I thank you for this day and this chance to be here. And my prayer is that we would look to ourselves, God, and look within us and not be obsessed with maybe following rules that people put on us about what church or what religion is supposed to look like, God. But we seek to look in ourselves, and we find that burning within our souls that realizes that we can't get to you by ourselves. And that all of these things that we know that all of these things that are within us, this evil of our own hearts, God, and we know that you are the one that changes us. We don't change ourselves. And that is what we seek, God, that kind of holiness where you change us. We thank you for this church and this place where we can kind of wrestle with those kind of interior questions and those things within us, and a place where we can feel comfortable talking about this wrestling. And we don't have to feel the need to put on a religious mask and pretend like we've got this all figured out. We thank you so much for this journey and these companions along the journey. Amen. Please stand.